The thing about Caleb is that he cannot lie. Not in the defiant, principled way that some children refuse dishonesty, more in the physiological sense, the way certain people can't digest dairy or tolerate loud noise. When Caleb is hiding something, his left eye twitches. Just once, just slightly, but I've known it since he was 4 years old, and I have never once been wrong about what it means. He got it from me. My mother always said I had the same tell, and she was right about that too. So when he sat across from me at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning in March and told me he'd slept fine and wasn't worried about anything and school was good, I watched his left eye and I said nothing. It twitched. I poured him more orange juice and asked him what he wanted to do that afternoon, and he said maybe the park, and I said sure, the park sounds good. He ate his cereal with the careful focus of a child performing normalcy, and I watched him the way I watch my students when they're about to tell me the dog ate their homework, with patience, and without pressure, because pressure never gets you the truth faster. It just gets you a better lie. Zoe came downstairs 20 minutes later, already dressed, hair pulled back, earbuds in. She was 13 and had recently acquired the slightly armored quality that 13-year-old girls develop as a matter of survival, not hostile, exactly, but sealed. She poured herself coffee, which she had started doing in the past month and which I'd decided not to comment on. She glanced at Caleb. Something passed between them, quick, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. I knew what to look for. "Morning," I said. "Morning," she said, and put her earbuds back in. Melissa was in the shower. I could hear the water running through the ceiling. In 45 minutes, she would come downstairs in her weekend clothes and kiss me on the cheek and ask what the plan was, and I would tell her, and the morning would arrange itself into the shape of a normal Saturday. This had been the pattern for 14 years, and it was a good pattern, or it had seemed like one. You build your life inside a pattern long enough and you stop seeing the pattern. You just see your life. My name is Nathan. I'm 44 years old. I teach AP History at Hartwell High School in Columbia, South Carolina, which means I spend my days explaining to 16-year-olds why the past matters, how the decisions people make under pressure, in private, when they believe no one is watching, are always the decisions that define them in the end. I have always believed this. I believe it now more than ever. Melissa and I met when I was 30. She was 27, working her first pharmaceutical territory, driving a company car that she'd already put 2 minor dents in. We met at a friend's barbecue. She laughed at a joke I made about the Electoral College, actually laughed, not politely, and I thought, this one. We were married 14 months later in a garden ceremony in Charleston. Zoe was born 2 years after that, Caleb 4 years after Zoe. By the time he started kindergarten, I had arranged my sense of the future entirely around the 4 of us. I was still arranging it that Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, watching my son perform an innocence he didn't feel. He twitched again, unprompted, as if his body were apologizing for something his mouth hadn't said yet. Upstairs, the shower stopped. Melissa's job had always required a certain amount of movement. Pharmaceutical sales are not a desk-bound profession. She drove to clinics, to hospitals, to private practices spread across a territory that covered most of the Midlands' region, sometimes 40 miles in a day, sometimes twice that. In the early years of our marriage, I had found this glamorous in a mild way, the idea of her moving through the world with purpose and competence while I stood at a whiteboard explaining the Missouri Compromise. She was good at her job. She had the kind of social fluency that made people trust her quickly, a skill I admired and occasionally envied. The travel had picked up in the fall. New territory expansion, she explained, the company had restructured her region, added a cluster of practices in Lexington and Irmo that required more time on the road. She started leaving earlier some mornings. Twice in October she stayed overnight in Lexington rather than driving back late, which she had done occasionally before and which I accepted without question. There was a hotel the company used, she said. It was easier. I didn't question it. That's important to say plainly. I didn't question it because I had no framework for questioning it. In 14 years, Melissa had never given me a reason to scrutinize her schedule. The trust between us was not a conscious decision I renewed each morning, it was structural, built into the load-bearing walls of the marriage the way the electrical wiring is built into a house. You don't think about it. You just expect the lights to come on. What I did notice, without attaching significance to it, was that she had started going to the gym. This was October or early November. She announced it casually one evening. A new place had opened near her office, reasonable membership, she was going to try it. I thought nothing of it. Melissa had always talked about wanting to exercise more regularly and never quite managed it. I was mildly pleased she was trying. I asked if she wanted me to go with her sometime. She said maybe, sometime, she wanted to get into a routine first. I asked once more in December and she said she was still figuring out her schedule. I didn't ask again. The children noticed things before I did, though I didn't know that until later. Zoe, at 13, had the observational acuity of someone who had been quietly studying the adults around her for years. She noticed that her mother's phone had a new lock screen, not just a new passcode, but a pattern lock, which was different from the pin she'd always used. She noticed that her mother sprayed perfume before leaving for the gym, which struck her as odd even at 13. She didn't say anything to me. She filed it, the way perceptive teenagers file things, in a private register she hadn't yet decided what to do with. Caleb noticed less but felt more. He's that kind of child, absorptive, emotionally porous, the kind who comes home from school already carrying the mood of whoever sat next to him at lunch. He had picked up a tension in the house that he couldn't name. He'd started sleeping with the light on again, which he hadn't done since he was 6. I noticed the light and asked him about it. He said he'd had a bad dream. I believed him. Looking back now, the light was a signal. Not about bad dreams. About something he was already carrying that I hadn't been given access to yet. My colleague Coach Hartley, a physical education teacher who had been at Hartwell longer than anyone, said something to me in the faculty lounge one afternoon in late November that I filed away and then forgot about for months. We were talking about nothing in particular, and he mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd seen Melissa at the new gym on Blossom Street. Said she'd been there with someone, a guy he described as the owner. They seemed to know each other well, he said, and then he moved on to complaining about the parking situation and I moved on with him. I didn't think about it for another 3 months. I didn't ask because I didn't want to be the kind of husband who needed to ask. I had decided, somewhere in the architecture of my self-image, that asking would mean I was suspicious, and being suspicious would mean I didn't trust her, and not trusting her would mean something was wrong with me. The logic was circular and I couldn't see that yet. What I could see was the surface of things, a wife who came home tired and warm and smelling of shampoo, who helped Caleb with his homework and drove Zoe to her Saturday art classes and made dinner 3 nights out of 5 and lay beside me in the dark and seemed, by every visible measure, to be exactly where she was supposed to be. January arrived cold and gray, the particular flatness of a southern winter that never fully commits to being winter. The overnight stays in Lexington increased. Not dramatically, from once a month to roughly twice a month, and then in January it happened 3 times. Each time the explanation was consistent: late client dinners, early morning appointments, the practical mathematics of not driving 40 minutes home at 11 at night. Each time she texted me the name of the hotel, which she'd started doing without my asking, which I recognized even then as slightly unusual. You don't volunteer the hotel name unless you've registered that the hotel name is something someone might want. I told myself she was being considerate. The gym had become a regular commitment. 4 times a week, sometimes 5. She was in better shape than she'd been in years, which I noticed and mentioned, and which she received with a slightly complicated smile, pleased, but something underneath the pleasure that I couldn't quite read. I thought it was self-consciousness. I thought she was still calibrating how to accept a compliment about her body after years of saying she wanted to change it. In February, Iris came for dinner. Iris was Melissa's closest friend from work, a fellow sales rep, late 30s, recently divorced, with a loud laugh and strong opinions about wine. She came over every 6 weeks or so. That evening she and Melissa sat at one end of the table talking about a regional conference they'd both attended, and I was mostly listening while helping Caleb with a puzzle he'd brought to the table. At one point I got up to get more water, and I heard Iris say quietly, not whispering, just lowering her register, "You need to be more careful." And Melissa said, "I know. I am." And then they both looked up and saw me in the doorway, and the conversation pivoted cleanly to the conference hotel's terrible breakfast options. I stood at the sink and let the tap run cold. I didn't ask. I don't know, even now, whether I should have. Asking would have required acknowledging that I'd heard something that required an explanation, and I wasn't ready to open that door. I had spent the past 4 months building increasingly elaborate structures of plausible reason, and each one felt solid enough until I examined it directly, at which point it softened. "You need to be more careful." "I know. I am." That sentence lived in me for the next 3 weeks. I turned it over at odd moments, in the car, at my desk, in the 10 minutes before sleep. I gave it every interpretation except the right one. A work issue. Something involving a client. A complaint from the regional office. People say things at dinner tables that don't mean what they sound like out of context. Then Caleb's light was on again at midnight on a Tuesday, and I went to check on him, and he was sitting up in bed with his arms around his knees, and when I asked him what was wrong, he said, "Nothing. I'm just thinking." "About what?" He looked at me for a long moment. His left eye didn't twitch, but something in his face did. A hesitation that was too old for 9 years old. "About whether keeping a secret is the same as lying," he said. I sat on the edge of his bed. "That depends," I said carefully, "on what the secret is and who it's hurting." He thought about this. Then he said, "What if it's hurting you?" I looked at him in the low light and felt the floor shift in some way I couldn't yet quantify. "Then," I said, "it's probably not a secret worth keeping." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. He lay back down and I pulled the blanket up and sat there until his breathing steadied, and then I went back to the bedroom and lay beside Melissa in the dark and listened to her sleep. I hadn't put it together yet. But something inside had already broken, quietly, without announcement, the way a hairline fracture forms in a structure long before the visible collapse. I began paying attention the way I teach my students to read primary sources, not looking for what confirms what you already think, but looking for what doesn't fit. The first thing that didn't fit was the mileage claim. Melissa submitted monthly mileage reports to her company for reimbursement. She'd always done this, and occasionally I'd helped her calculate the routes at tax time. In late February I looked at her February report, which was sitting open on the kitchen counter near her laptop. The total mileage for the month was consistent with her territory. But I knew from 14 years of marriage that she typically rounded up her routes slightly when filing, not dishonestly, just imprecisely. What I noticed was that 3 of the Lexington overnight entries showed mileage that corresponded to the hotel she'd named. Exactly. Down to the mile. People who are being honest don't measure distances precisely. People who are building an alibi do. I wrote the dates down. The same 3 dates corresponded to the 3 overnight stays in January that had already been sitting in my memory like stones in a pocket. The second thing was Derek. I found the name by accident, the way you find most things you weren't looking for. I was using Melissa's car one Sunday, mine was in the shop, and I connected my phone to the Bluetooth and her recent calls came up on the display. I wasn't looking. The display just showed them. The name Derek appeared 4 times in the previous 2 weeks, the calls averaging 20 or 30 minutes each. I didn't recognize the name. I sat with the car idling in the driveway for a moment. I thought, it could be a client. It could be a colleague. It could be a dozen things. Then I remembered what Coach Hartley had said in November, the gym on Blossom Street, the owner, they seemed to know each other well, and the name and the gym and the mileage and the careful hotel distances, and you need to be more careful, aligned in a single second with the specific, irreversible clarity of a structural failure I had been ignoring the early warning signs of for months. I drove to the pharmacy. I didn't need anything from the pharmacy. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't my house. The red herring came in the form of a text message I was never meant to see. Melissa left her phone on the charger in the kitchen one morning while she was in the garage looking for something. It lit up with a message preview. I wasn't trying to read it, I was standing 2 feet away pouring coffee, but the preview was visible. The name was Iris. The message said, "He called me again. This has to stop." I spent the next week convinced that he was Derek, that Iris knew about it and was trying to end it, that Iris was in some way an ally I hadn't known I had. I even considered, briefly, calling Iris directly. What I learned later, much later, was that Iris's message referred to an ex-boyfriend of hers who had been harassing her since the divorce. Iris knew nothing about Derek. Or if she did, she'd been protecting Melissa from me rather than the other way around. The lesson I had to sit with, eventually, was this: I had been looking for someone to rescue me from what I was slowly finding out. I wanted an intermediary, a source who would hand me the truth at a safe remove. But the truth was already in the house. It had been in the house for months. It was sleeping down the hall. Zoe came to me on a Thursday evening in early March. Melissa was at the gym, or said she was. Caleb was doing homework at the kitchen table. Zoe knocked on my study door, which she rarely did, and came in and sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at me with the expression of someone who has made a decision after a long internal argument with themselves. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, but I need you to not get upset in front of Caleb." I put down my pen. "Okay," I said. She told me. Not everything, she didn't have everything. What she had was this: 6 weeks earlier, she had come home early from a friend's house and found a man she didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table with her mother. When Melissa saw Zoe, she went pale. She introduced the man as a work colleague, and he left within minutes. Afterward, Melissa had taken Zoe aside and asked her not to mention it to me. She said it was a sensitive work situation, a client with some personal problems, and it would be awkward if Nathan knew. She asked Zoe to keep it between them. Zoe had kept it for 6 weeks. "She made me feel like I was helping her," Zoe said. Her voice was steady but her hands weren't. "But then I started thinking about what you said, I mean, you've said it 100 times, about how the truth is still the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And I thought." She stopped. "You thought it was hurting me," I said. She nodded. I came around the desk and sat beside her and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside the study window the evening light was going amber and thin, the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. "You did the right thing," I said. "I need you to know that clearly. Are you and Mom going to be okay?" I looked at her, 13 years old, trying to hold herself together in my doorway, having carried something that wasn't hers to carry for 6 weeks because her mother had handed it to her. I didn't lie to her. "I don't know yet," I said. "But whatever happens, it has nothing to do with you." She nodded and left. I sat at my desk until the amber light went gray. That was when I understood, in the full and final way, what had been happening in my house. Not a suspicion anymore. Not a structure of plausible reason. The clarity was total and it felt nothing like relief. Melissa came home at 8:15. Caleb was already in bed. Zoe was in her room with the door closed. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched, in the same chair where I'd eaten breakfast that morning watching my son's eye twitch. She came through the door with her gym bag and her keys and her phone and the particular post-workout looseness that I'd spent months interpreting as health and happiness. She stopped when she saw me. Not because of guilt, or not only because of guilt. Because I was sitting in the dark. I hadn't turned the kitchen light on, and the only illumination was the weak glow coming from the stove clock and the streetlight through the window, and I was sitting very still. "Why is it dark in here?" she said. "Sit down," I said. She sat. She put her bag on the floor and her keys on the table and her phone, face down, as always, beside the keys. She looked at me with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. "Nathan. I know about Derek," I said. "The name in the room between us." She didn't deny it. I had half expected her to, had prepared, somewhere in the last 2 hours, for the performance of denial, the demand for evidence, the counter-accusation that sometimes comes when people are cornered. None of that happened. She looked at the table and her shoulders dropped in a way that looked less like guilt and more like exhaustion, the relief, I realized, of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time. "How long?" I said. 7 months, she said. 7 months. Since August. Since before the gym, before the overnights, before the new lock screen and the careful mileage, and you need to be more careful. Since the summer, when I thought everything was fine, when we took the kids to the beach and I have photographs of us all standing in the water, laughing. "Did you bring him here?" A pause. "Once. When the kids were home." It wasn't a question. She understood that. She looked up at me. "Zoe saw him," I said. Something changed in her face. Not surprise, the possibility had clearly lived in her. Something more like the specific dread of a consequence she'd hoped to outrun. I asked her not to. "You asked our 13-year-old daughter to lie to me," I said. My voice was level. I had made a decision, in the 2 hours at the kitchen table, to stay level. Not for her benefit, for mine. You put her in the middle of this. You made her carry your secret for 6 weeks. I was trying to protect her. You were trying to protect yourself. She didn't argue with that. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and I watched her and felt something that was neither rage nor grief but a third thing, quieter and more permanent, the recognition of a fundamental gap between the person I had believed I was married to and the person sitting across the table in the dark kitchen. We talked for 2 hours. I won't recount all of it. What I will say is that she was honest, in that room, in a way she had not been honest with me for at least 7 months, possibly longer, in the smaller ways that precede the larger ones. She told me about Derek. She told me what it had been, what she had told herself about it, where she thought it was going. She told me she had ended it 2 weeks earlier. She told me she still loved me. I listened to all of it. "I believe you ended it," I said, when she was finished. "And I believe you're sorry. But I need you to understand something, Melissa." I looked at her across the table. "You didn't just betray me. You put our daughter in the position of carrying your betrayal. She lost 6 weeks of being a 13-year-old because you needed someone to keep your secret. I don't know how to weigh that. I don't know if it's even weighable." She said my name. "I need you to sleep somewhere else tonight," I said. "I need the house to be quiet." She went upstairs. I heard her moving around, heard the guest room door close. I sat at the kitchen table until the stove clock read 11:40, and then I turned off the light and went upstairs and stood for a moment outside Zoe's door, listening. Silence. Then, quietly, "Dad?" "Yeah," I said through the door. "Are you okay?" "I'm working on it," I said. "Go to sleep." A pause. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," I said. "More than you know." The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. Melissa stayed in the guest room. We told the children that we were working through some things, that adults sometimes needed space to think, that nothing about this was their fault or their responsibility. Caleb accepted this with the relief of a child who has been carrying a weight and has now been told he can set it down. Zoe accepted it with the wariness of someone who has seen too much of the machinery to fully trust the surface again. That last part was what I couldn't move past. I spent those 2 weeks trying, genuinely trying, to find the path back. I know what I'm supposed to say here, and it's not that I was unwilling to forgive. I sat with it seriously. I thought about 14 years, about who we had been to each other, about the children, about the life we'd built in this house. I went to one session with a couples counselor because I believed I owed us at least that. I sat in a chair across from a woman with reading glasses and a notepad, and I tried to find the argument for staying. What I found instead was the image of Zoe's face in my study doorway. Not Melissa and Derek. Not the hotel stays or the mileage or the 7 months. What I kept returning to was my daughter sitting in the chair across from my desk, hands trembling, telling me she'd been asked to protect her mother's secret from her father. 13 years old. She should have been thinking about her art classes and her friendships and the ordinary complications of being 13. Instead, she had spent 6 weeks as a custodian of her mother's guilt. That, more than anything else, was the thing I couldn't rebuild around. I understand, in the abstract, that people make terrible choices under pressure, that affairs are not simple events but complex collapses that happen over time, that Melissa was not a villain but a person who had made catastrophically bad decisions. I hold all of that. I can analyze it with the dispassion of someone who has spent years explaining historical failures of judgment to teenagers. Understanding something and living inside its consequences are two entirely different things. I told Melissa in the 3rd week that I wanted to separate. She cried, not the manipulative kind, not performance. Real grief, real loss. I believed it was real. It didn't change my answer. I found an apartment in the 5 Points neighborhood in April, a 2-bedroom, so the kids could have space when they were with me. We worked out a custody arrangement without lawyers, which I credit to both of us. Melissa cooperated with a straightforwardness that I think came from understanding, finally, that she had no ground left to negotiate from. Zoe spent the first weekend at my apartment sitting on the couch doing her homework in comfortable silence while I graded papers at the kitchen table. At one point she looked up and said, "Is this weird for you?" "A little," I said. "Is it weird for you?" She considered it. "Kind of. But not bad weird." "Yeah," I said. "That's about right." Caleb, predictably, was more interested in which of his toys he could keep at my place than in the emotional logistics of the situation. He brought his puzzle set and a blanket he'd had since he was 4 and announced that the apartment was actually pretty good because it had a big window where you could see the street. He stood at that window for 10 minutes on the first evening, narrating the passing cars with the commentary of a 9-year-old who has decided that a new situation is acceptable. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him, and something in my chest that had been compressed for months expanded slightly. Donna, my mother, called in May. She's 71, lives in Greenville, asks 2 questions per phone call and makes them count. "Are you eating?" she said. "Yes," I said. "Are the kids okay?" "They're getting there," I said. Zoe more slowly. Caleb faster. "It's about what you'd expect." "And you?" That was 3 questions. I didn't point it out. "I'm getting there too," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "the hardest part of a thing like this isn't the anger. The anger is easy. It's loud and it takes up space and it knows what it's doing. The hard part is after the anger, when you have to decide who you're going to be from here." I didn't say anything. "You were always good at deciding that," she said. "Even when you were small." After I hung up, I sat with that for a while. Who you're going to be from here. There's a version of this story where I define myself by what was done to me. I've met people who live there, not dramatically, not with obvious bitterness, but organized around a wound, measuring everything by its distance from the moment of damage. I don't want that. I don't think I'm capable of it, structurally. The way I'm built, I have to keep moving forward or the whole thing seizes up. It's September now. School started 3 weeks ago. I have a new cohort of juniors who are working through the causes of World War I with the skepticism of teenagers who find all historical decisions baffling. I find this encouraging. I've started running in the mornings, which I haven't done since my 20s. The apartment on 5 Points has become, incrementally and without ceremony, home. Melissa and I are cordial. We manage the children's schedule with a business-like efficiency that occasionally surprises me, not because I expected hostility, but because I hadn't anticipated how quickly necessity reorganizes behavior. She is in therapy. She told me this without asking for credit, just as information. I respected that. Zoe is slower to trust her mother than Caleb is, which follows from what she knows and what she carried. There have been some hard conversations between them. I stay out of those, they're not mine to manage. What I see, from the outside, is that Zoe is processing it with the seriousness it deserves, and that Melissa is meeting that seriousness without defending herself, which may be the most important thing she could do. Caleb asked me last month whether I still liked Mom. I thought about it. I don't dislike her, I said. We just can't be married anymore. He thought about this with his particular 9-year-old thoroughness. That's actually kind of sad, he said. Yeah, I said. It kind of is. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his puzzle. I realized, in a quiet and unhurried way, that I have learned more about myself in the past 8 months than in the previous decade. Not the dramatic kind of learning that arrives with crisis, I mean the slower, more useful kind. The understanding of which assumptions I had been living inside without examining them. The places where I had chosen comfort over clarity, where I'd let the architecture of the marriage carry weight I should have been paying closer attention to. I don't carry this as accusation. I carry it as information. It belongs to me. The morning light comes through the 5 Points window at an angle that hits the kitchen table just right. I drink my coffee there before the kids wake up, on the weekends they're with me, and I watch the street below, the early dog walkers and the delivery trucks and the gradual quickening of a Saturday morning, and I feel, if not entirely whole, then at least honest. Which may, in the end, be the better thing to be. What this story is really about is the weaponization of trust, not just between a husband and wife, but across every relationship in the household. Most betrayal narratives focus on the couple. This one earns its weight by expanding the frame. Melissa didn't only deceive Nathan. She recruited her daughter into the deception, handed a 13-year-old a secret that had no business living in a child's custody, and in doing so fractured something that the marriage's collapse alone might not have broken, Zoe's unguarded faith in her mother. That shift, from marital failure to parental failure, is what made Nathan's decision irreversible. He could conceivably have found a way to rebuild around the affair. He could not find a way to rebuild around the image of his daughter in his study doorway, 6 weeks older in ways she shouldn't have had to be. There's a psychological pattern worth naming here. When people are sustaining a secret that is too large to contain alone, they instinctively seek a repository, someone to share the weight. The choice of repository reveals something critical about the secret keeper's internal hierarchy. Melissa chose Zoe. Not Iris, her adult colleague and friend, who already knew something was wrong. Not a therapist. Not her own mother. She chose the child who idolized her and was least equipped to refuse. That choice was not strategic in any calculated sense, it was the reflexive move of someone who needed relief and reached for the nearest available vessel. But its consequences were more damaging than the affair itself, because it transformed Zoe from a daughter into a co-conspirator, and 13-year-olds don't recover from that transformation quietly. The accumulation at the heart of this story is worth tracing carefully. Nothing Nathan noticed was individually conclusive. The gym. The mileage. The name on the Bluetooth display. Coach Hartley's offhand comment in November, buried under a conversation about parking. Iris's whispered warning at the dinner table. Caleb's light on at midnight. Each detail was, in isolation, explainable. What made them devastating was the pattern they formed together, a structure whose load-bearing logic was only visible once Nathan stopped trying to interpret each piece charitably and began reading the whole. This is one of the story's most honest psychological observations: charitable interpretation is not naivety. It is a rational choice made by people who understand, at some level, that the alternative will cost them everything. Nathan wasn't blind. He was making a daily decision about how much he was prepared to see. The moment that decision became unsustainable wasn't when the evidence became overwhelming, it was when it became personal. When Caleb asked whether keeping a secret was the same as lying. When Zoe came to his study door. The children didn't expose Melissa because they were betraying her. They exposed her because they had reached the limit of what they could carry without breaking, and they chose their father's right to know over their mother's need to be protected. That is not a small thing. That is children, at 9 and 13, demonstrating a moral clarity that the adults in the house had been unable to maintain. What Nathan does with the aftermath is, in its own quiet way, the most important part of the story. He doesn't perform forgiveness, he doesn't feel. He doesn't collapse into the kind of permanent grievance that reorganizes an entire identity around a wound. He moves. Not away from the pain, through it, and out the other side, into an apartment with morning light and a kitchen table and a son who narrates passing cars from the window. The marriage ended. The family, in a different shape, continued. And Nathan, stripped of the particular comfort of 14 years of assumed stability, found himself, as his mother predicted, deciding who he was going to be from here. That decision, quiet, undramatic, made over coffee rather than in confrontation, is where the real story lives.